What happens when arrogance collides with unshakable discipline? At the tomb of the unknown soldier, silence isn't a request, it's a requirement. But one man, standing among the crowd, thought he could test the guard's legendary composure. What he didn't realize was that his face would betray everything the moment the guard responded. And in front of a hushed audience, his experiment turned into one of the most humbling lessons of his life. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe for more powerful stories of honor, sacrifice, and respect. The day was like any other at Arlington National Cemetery. The air was warm and the sky a brilliant blue, yet the atmosphere was steeped in silence and reverence. Visitors shuffled carefully across the marble walkways, speaking in hushed tones, their footsteps echoing faintly as they made their way toward the tomb of the unknown soldier. For many, this was more than a tourist attraction. It was a pilgrimage, a chance to stand in the presence of ultimate sacrifice. And then there were the guards. Dressed in immaculate dark blue uniforms with gold trim, their shoes polished to mirrors, rifles gleaming in the sunlight. They marched with an exactness that defied human error. 21 steps, pause, 21 seconds, turn, 21 steps back. Every movement was deliberate, rehearsed until it became second nature. Nothing was accidental, nothing was out of place. These sentinels weren't just soldiers on duty. They were living symbols of respect, carrying the weight of tradition on their shoulders every moment they stood watch. The crowd that day was a mix of school groups, families, veterans, and curious tourists. They clustered along the ropes, cameras in hand, their voices subdued by the heavy atmosphere of the place. Yet among them was one man who stood out, not because of his clothing. He wore a simple polo shirt, khaki shorts, and sneakers, blending in with the rest, but because of his attitude. At first he seemed like everyone else. He leaned casually against the rope, hands in his pockets, watching the sentinel's steady march with mild curiosity. But soon his posture shifted. He tilted his head, smirked slightly, and whispered to a friend beside him. The friend chuckled nervously, glancing at the guard as if hoping no one had heard. The man, however, grew bolder. It was clear he wanted to test the guard. To him, perhaps, this was nothing more than theater, a soldier performing an elaborate ceremony. And what is theater without a little disruption? But what he failed to understand was that this wasn't performance. It wasn't entertainment, it was devotion. The man began subtly, a loud cough, exaggerated and unnatural, echoing louder than necessary in the hushed space. The guard didn't flinch. He continued his steps, head held high, rifle balanced at his side with perfect discipline. The man grinned, pleased with himself. Next came a shuffle forward, leaning ever so slightly past the rope as though testing how close he could get before the guard noticed. A mother nearby pulled her child back, with a firm hand shooting the man a glare. He ignored her, too caught up in his own experiment. He tried again, yawning loudly and theatrically, stretching his arms wide as if to mock the seriousness of the guard's movements. Once again, the sentinel didn't respond. His steps were steady, his face unchanging, his eyes fixed straight ahead. For many in the crowd, the man's antics were irritating, even offensive. Veterans stiffened. Parents whispered harsh warnings to their children, using the man as an example of how not to behave. Some tourists looked away, embarrassed on his behalf. But the man himself seemed determined, his smirk growing wider with each failed attempt. To him, this was a game. How far could he go before the guard reacted? How much discipline did these soldiers really have? What he didn't realize was that his so-called game was about to come to an end, and that when it did, his own face would tell the entire story. The atmosphere thickened as tension spread quietly through the crowd. Everyone could feel it, the sense that something was about to happen. And while the man thought he was the one in control, it was the sentinel who had been in command all along. The guard's boots struck the pavement with the precision of a metronome, each step echoing across the silent plaza. For the sentinel, This was routine. The culmination of years of training and discipline, a ceremony that never faltered. For the man standing among the crowd, however, it had become a challenge. His earlier attempts to provoke a reaction had failed, but instead of stopping, he seemed emboldened. He leaned back against the rope with exaggerated confidence, his smirk growing wider. His companion beside him, visibly uneasy, whispered something, a suggestion perhaps to quit while he was ahead. But the man shook his head, his eyes locked on the guard like a predator watching prey. Only, he didn't realize that in this dynamic, he was not the hunter. He was the one on display. He cleared his throat loudly again, the sound grating and deliberate. Still, the sentinel didn't so much as flicker. His chin remained high, his eyes forward, his rifle balanced with mechanical grace. It was as if the man didn't exist at all. The crowd, however, noticed. Several heads turned his way. A veteran in a dark cap, the kind given to those who served decades before, muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disgust. A young boy tugged at his mother's hand, asking why the man was making so much noise. The mother bent down and whispered that some people didn't understand respect. The man grinned at the attention. For him, this was fuel. He stretched his arms again, yawning loudly, then leaned forward, pretending to stumble near the rope. A ripple of discomfort spread through the spectators. Several people gasped softly, fearing he might cross the invisible line that everyone knew not to break. He didn't step across, but he got close enough to make his point. The guard's march continued. 21 steps, a sharp pivot, 21 seconds of stillness. The discipline was absolute. If the man was hoping for a crack, a twitch, even the flick of an eye, he was disappointed. The sentinel may as well have been carved from stone, his body a living monument of tradition. Frustration flickered across the man's face, though he masked it quickly with another grin. He wasn't ready to give up. He leaned to his friend again, whispering something with a chuckle. The friend's smile was weak, more nervous than amused, his eyes darting between the guard and the crowd that was beginning to shift uncomfortably. And then, the man tried something bolder. He cupped his hands around his mouth and made a faint, mocking whistle, not loud enough to be a true disruption, but enough to be noticed. The sharp notes cut across the silence like a blade. A murmur swept through the onlookers. A few turned away in disgust. Others glared openly now, their patience wearing thin. Through it all, the guard remained unbroken. His posture was impeccable, his rhythm flawless. Even the air around him seemed to bend to his control, as though the world itself moved at the pace of his boots. The man, however, began to feel the shift in atmosphere. His smirk faltered, just for a second, when he noticed the weight of the stairs around him. He brushed it off, adjusting his sunglasses and pretending not to care, but something in his eyes betrayed the faintest trace of doubt. Still, he pressed on. Another cough, another exaggerated shuffle, another whispered joke. Each attempt was weaker than the last, more desperate, less confident. It was becoming clear that the man had underestimated the resolve of the soldier before him. He had thought of the sentinel as just another performer, someone whose routine could be broken. But this was no performance. This was a sacred duty. The crowd grew quieter, more focused, their attention less on the ceremony itself and more on the tension building between the man and the guard. It was as if the entire plaza was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The man noticed this too. For a moment, he reveled in it. The spotlight was his, the whispers surrounding him proof that he had drawn the eyes of dozens. But what he didn't realize was that every whisper, every sideways glance, carried not admiration but judgment. They weren't impressed. They were waiting for the inevitable moment when his arrogance would crumble, and it was coming. The guard reached the end of his mat again. He pivoted with military sharpness, pausing in perfect stillness. The air was thick with anticipation. The man chuckled under his breath, raising his eyebrows at his friend as if to say, "See? Nothing breaks him. But beneath that smirk, a nervous energy was creeping in. He was starting to sense that the game he thought he was playing was about to end, and not on his terms. The guard's discipline had not cracked, but the man's confidence was beginning to. His laughter was a little too forced, his movements a little less bold. And though he didn't yet know it, the sentinel had already decided how this test would end. The guard reached the end of his mat once more, executing his pivot with such sharpness that it seemed like the crack of a rifle shot. 21 seconds of stillness followed. The weight of silence pressed against the plaza, heavier than before. The crowd was no longer whispering. They were watching, waiting. Even the flags seemed to pause in the breeze, as if the entire space had shifted into anticipation. And then it happened. The man, emboldened by his own arrogance and the uneasy attention he had gathered, leaned just a fraction too far over the rope. His hand lifted slightly, a mocking wave, not enough to be seen as outright crossing, but more than enough to shatter the unspoken boundary of respect. A ripple of gasps surged through the crowd. Mothers pulled their children closer. A veteran clenched his jaw so tightly his face flushed red, but the sentinel did not let it slide. With a sudden, thunderous stomp that cracked like a cannon against the stone, the guard brought his boot down and halted his march. The sound sliced through the plaza, sharp and final. The man jerked back instinctively, his smirk freezing on his face. His sunglasses slipped slightly down his nose, revealing eyes that had lost their confidence. The guard's voice, when it came, was not a shout in the ordinary sense. It was something far more commanding, a tone forged in discipline, echoing across generations of soldiers who had stood where he now stood. Remain behind the barrier. Show proper respect. Every syllable was precise, clipped, and immovable. It wasn't anger, it wasn't emotion, it was authority in its purest form. The kind that brooked no argument, no hesitation. The man's smirk vanished completely. His face drained of color as the gravity of the moment sank in. He had wanted a reaction, but not this. He had thought he could push without consequence, tease without reprisal. Now standing in the echo of those words, he realized just how foolish his game had been. The crowd erupted, not in noise, but in stillness. It was a silence so profound that it carried its own power. The shift was palpable. Where moments earlier there had been tension, now there was clarity. The sentinel had spoken, and his words had restored the sacred weight of the ceremony. The man stumbled back from the rope, his bravado crumbling like dust in the wind. He glanced at his friend for support, but found none. His companion's eyes were fixed on the ground, unwilling to meet his gaze, ashamed by association. And still, the guard stood tall. His rifle glinted in the sunlight, his uniform immaculate, his face as unyielding as stone. For a long moment, he did not move, letting the echo of his command linger in the air. It was not just a rebuke to the man, it was a reminder to everyone present that the tomb was not a stage, not a spectacle, but a place of sacrifice and honor. Finally, the sentinel resumed his march. His boots struck the stone with renewed force, each step a declaration that nothing, not arrogance, not disrespect, not even mockery, could shake his discipline. The man, meanwhile, seemed to shrink into the crowd. The smirk that had defined him earlier was gone, replaced by a tight jaw and lowered eyes. His hands fidgeted nervously at his sides, as though he wished he could disappear. The laughter he had once wielded so easily had evaporated, leaving only the weight of shame. The crowd's eyes followed the guard, not him. No one cared to look at the man anymore. He had tried to steal attention, but now the spotlight belonged solely to the sentinel, as it always had. Some spectators nodded silently, their respect deepened. A child whispered to his father, "He's like a statue," and the father nodded, his own eyes glistening with pride. For the man, the realization was crushing. His attempt to mock, to disrupt, to test, had ended with him being stripped of dignity in front of strangers. Yet the sentinel had not humiliated him with theatrics or anger. He had done it with discipline, with a single command, spoken with calm authority. He had shifted the balance completely, and the man would never forget it. The moment hung in the air, unforgettable, before dissolving back into the rhythm of the march. 21 steps, 21 seconds, a pivot. The guard's movements carried on as though nothing had happened, because for him, it hadn't. Duty was unbroken, but for everyone else, especially the man, something had changed forever. When the echo of the guard's command finally faded, a heavy stillness settled across the crowd. It wasn't the silence of awkwardness anymore. It was reverence. No one dared whisper. No one shifted or coughed or shuffled their feet. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the measured strikes of the guard's boots and the faint rustle of flags fluttering overhead. The man who had mocked the sentinel earlier tried to blend into the crowd, but there was no hiding from what had just happened. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line, his sunglasses barely concealing the embarrassment written across his features. The confident posture he had carried earlier was gone. Now his shoulders slumped, his hands tucked into his pockets like a child who had been scolded in front of the class. Beside him, his companion stood stiffly, avoiding eye contact with the others in the crowd. Every few moments, he would glance at the guard, his eyes wide, his expression humbled, as though silently apologizing for the disrespect they had both been a part of. But the sentinel never looked at them again. For him, the incident was finished. He had carried out his duty. Nothing more, nothing less. The discipline of the guard meant that personal feelings had no place in his role. What mattered was the tomb, the unknown soldiers resting there, and the sacred tradition he was sworn to uphold. And that was precisely what made the moment so powerful. The man who had mocked him could no longer laugh, because he now understood that the guard wasn't a performer on a stage. He wasn't an actor playing a role. He was a soldier, carrying out one of the most solemn responsibilities in the world, guarding the memory of those who had given everything and whose names were lost to history. As the guard continued his 21 steps, the crowd seemed to absorb this truth in silence. For some, it was a moment of education. For others, a reminder of why they had come in the first place. Parents pulled their children a little closer, whispering softly about respect, sacrifice, and honor. Veterans in the crowd stood even taller, their chests swelling with pride as they watched the sentinel's unshakable discipline. But perhaps the most dramatic change was in the man himself. He had entered this place with laughter, testing boundaries, treating the sacred ceremony as though it were a spectacle. But by the end, he could barely raise his eyes. His face told the entire story. Gone was the smirk, the casual arrogance, the mocking smile. What remained was something raw. Shame. Yes, but also humility, and that humility mattered. Because in that brief confrontation, the guard had not just defended the sanctity of the tomb, he had forced a lesson on someone who desperately needed it. Without shouting, without anger, without breaking the dignity of the moment, he had shown the man that certain lines should never be crossed. The incident also rippled through the crowd. Though no one spoke of it openly, the silence afterward was different from the silence before. It was heavier, deeper, filled with the shared understanding that they had just witnessed something important. Not just a guard doing his job, but a living example of why discipline, respect, and tradition matter. When the relief guard finally appeared to take the post, the transition was as seamless and precise as always. The new sentinel assumed the duty with the same sharpness, the same reverence, the same unbroken discipline. For them, nothing had changed, but for the man, and for everyone else who had stood watching, everything had. As the crowd began to disperse, the man lingered for a moment. He stared at the mat where the sentinel marched, his expression difficult to read. There was no laughter left in him, only the weight of a lesson he hadn't asked for, but had received nonetheless. Some in the crowd shot him sidelong glances, but most ignored him completely. Their attention, their respect, remained with the guard and with the tomb. The man turned and walked away, his steps slower than when he had first arrived. His arrogance had been stripped from him, replaced by something he couldn't quite put into words, but the look on his face said it all. This was no ordinary encounter. This was a moment that would stay with him and with the crowd for the rest of their lives. Because at the tomb of the unknown soldier, there are no second chances for respect. You either give it freely, or it will be demanded in the most unforgettable way possible. And on that day, one man's smile disappeared fast. Not because the guard lost his discipline, but because the guard never did.